Hi, Ryan.
Hi.
I know you're from the security side. And hi, Jason. I know you're from the developer side. Thank you for joining me today, and I'm glad that you two are getting together because I know that there have been some conflicts between you two in your respective departments. So that's why we're here. So let's talk about what's happening. Ryan, let's start with you. What's going on?
Well, I think one of the things that I've seen is a fundamental transformation in the security of an organization. When I started in security several years ago, at least 10, 15 years ago, the focus was on gates around our organization, putting up firewalls, preventing people from gaining access. And along came the internet, and all that went out the window. So what keeps me up at night now is applications, because applications are sort of front and center to the lifeblood of our organization. It used to be the network, now it's all about the applications, because it's applications which control fundamentally access and exposure to our data, which is at the end of the day is what I'm most concerned about, is risk or exposure of our data to hackers or third parties which have nefarious interests, so to say. And I think one of the things that has me most concerned is that the way in which we treat application development is different. If we treated application development like we treat building bridges, nobody would ever drive over them. I mean, I think that's the problem that we have.
Yeah. So, I mean, I'm not sure that you can equate how software developers are building software to be, they don't have the instructions really to integrate the security information I think you're talking about. So I don't think you can blame developers for the lack of security in application development because they really don't have the tools or the information in a timely fashion to actually integrate it. So I understand what you're saying, but I don't think it is. I think it's an organizational problem. I don't think it's a developer who is intentionally ignoring the intent of security policy and trying to bypass it. I don't think they have the capabilities within the organization to actually adhere to what you would like.
So I agree. I mean, they're definitely, I'm sure they're probably not doing it intentionally. But you also have to agree that they own some level of responsibility. They're sort of held to the same standard.
Sure, but I don't think their incentives are aligned to actually carry out that degree of integrity as far as security goes, because it's I have to create this application, I have these features to develop, I have the VP of sales breathing down my neck to actually produce this thing quickly, and the security policies that come into play are not given the same priority as the feature development and getting it out the door and getting it sold or getting it into production. Those alignments are simply not there, and the developer is usually left holding the bag or being blamed for security concerns when they really don't have the capability to remediate anything.
Well, I mean, at the end of the day, it's the business that's holding the bag.
Right, so yeah.
Okay, so it sounds like what currently is being used to manage application security isn't really working. Is that right?
Well, I mean, part of it is that the dynamics of application development has changed, right? Over the last, decade, we've seen what is an application, the definition of application change. It used to be, back when I started development, the developer wrote the code, right? I wrote every piece, right? The development team owned every line of code in the application. It was owned by someone in the development team. What we're seeing nowadays is that because we're building much more complex systems, that a complex system is built of much smaller components, much more like Legos, or if you look at manufacturing, it's an assembly line. We're more integrating and assembling than we are actually developing code from whole cloth.
Looking at applications that are developed today, they're 80% third-party components. Developers just can't finish the work they're being tasked to do without leveraging something that already exists. It would be almost impossible for a developer to finish a typical application these days without leveraging at least 80%, if not more, third-party components to add the functionality to their applications.
But from a hacker's perspective, they don't care whether you wrote the code or someone else wrote the code, right? So from a developer perspective, you have to own up to some of that responsibility that you are potentially introducing risk from some component that you're just downloading because you Googled it and you thought this was a good idea.
Yeah, and where the problems are, like that is developers should be responsible for what they create. There's no question about that. But take, for example, integrating, you're creating a big data application. The stack of components that you would integrate to create that application could be anywhere up to 50 to 100 components that would be pulled in as part of that stack. There is no way that a developer would have enough time to audit every single one of those components to validate that they met all security and compliance policies if they were to develop and ship the application on time.
So where's the buck stop, is the question.
Right, but there has to be some mediation between security and application development because it's too much work for developers. Right?
So what I'm hearing is that flawed components are making their way into applications because organizations just don't have they can't handle the complexity and the volume of these components that are being used in the applications, right?
Yeah, that's true. It really is, such a huge number of components that are being dealt with, and it's just an intractable problem for a development team by themselves.
And I mean, the risk is exasperated because the fact is, you take in one flawed component, and it is pervasive in your organization.
So if components are so prevalent right now, why hasn't the IT industry done something to try to help solve this issue that we're talking about?
Well, I don't think at a higher level, and we've been to organizations where this is visible, is they're not really aware that most of their applications consist of third-party components. They are still under the impression that they are developing most of the source code themselves. So what is happening in development is not known to higher levels in the organization, and it's a real risk to these businesses.
Well, and I think it goes back to when people think of open source, right? When you go read about open source, what is one of the first things that people think about in open source? It's Linux, right? They think of Linux and Red Hat, or they think of various cloud and OpenStack, or they think of databases and MySQL. When they think of open source, they think of these big applications. What they're not thinking of from an open source perspective is that there are these small little building blocks, which is a much bigger part of the ecosystem.
So what about some of the options that are available today, like DAST and SAST?
Well, first let's define them, right? DAST, Dynamic Application Security Testing, it's been around for a while, and it's fundamentally focused at looking at treating the application as a black box, right? So it doesn't really understand what happens inside of it, but it has some known ideas of what vulnerabilities could exist in an application. Then move on to the next one, being SAST, which is Source Code Application Security Testing. In that case, it's not looking at the live running application, it's looking at the source code. And as we mentioned, the amount of source code is actually shrinking, right? Developers are writing a much smaller amount of actual source code. So as that's shrinking, when you look at what source code analysis is actually testing, it's not testing the 80% which you're not developing. It's testing the 20% that you are. So it's not, once again, it's not really identifying that you may have issues in known components that have known vulnerabilities, right, which have known exploits on the internet, that anybody and their brother can download known tools, run automatically against your application, expose these holes. So even if you are using DAST, which I highly recommend, and you are using SAST, which I also recommend, they're only looking at a very small percentage of what is really the application today. Modern day application today. It's just changed.
And in addition to that being ineffective for the whole application, those two types of tools are very heavyweight, and they happen at the end of the development lifecycle. So again, at the end, you would be presenting the developers with information, one that's voluminous, so it takes a long time to sift through it. If they find a couple things that they actually go and investigate and they're not actually true, false positives, a developer is going to be very disinterested in looking at it ever again. And if you did find something that needed to be fixed and it happened earlier on in the application's development, you have to go all the way back and unwind it to actually do something with it after the fact.
Yeah. So are there security standards that address component requirements?
Well, it's really an emerging market. I think, PCI, we can think of the first, at least in my opinion, PCI is one of the first sort of watershed standards or regulatory bodies which actually spoke to application security. But one of the benefits that it did introduced, it talked about OWASP. And OWASP is what's called the Open Web Application Security Project. What it's primarily known for is the top 10, which is the top 10 vulnerabilities that every application developer should be aware of. Well, one of the most recent things is that in the new version, the 2013 version of the OWASP Top 10, they actually included language to talk about that developers shouldn't be using vulnerable components. I think it's really the first, loosey-goosey standards body or set of compliance or guidelines for development community, which actually talks about components in a language that says developers should understand what components they're actually using, and that if they have vulnerabilities, you shouldn't be using them. So I'm expecting that in the coming years, we're going to see more of that language creep in, both in government, government sourcing, commercial sourcing of projects, of inclusion of that kind of language in more standards.
Okay, so we've had some heated discussion here today, but I think we're making some progress. How about we shift and talk about some best practices?
So we're from Sonatype, so we've been in the component business forever, basically. We started the Apache Maven project, which is also responsible for the central repository. So these are the components that developers are using on a day-to-day basis. We've been heavily involved in open source, which is where almost all of these components are coming from. So in terms of actually learning about security, getting some of this information back to the open source projects and reintegrating it back into these components to make it safer for everyone, we have a very good vantage point for doing that. But in the products that we're developing, we're also interested in integrating, fixing, and monitoring. So by integration, we mean trying to get these tools and policies and practices in front of the developers and the tools and the workflows that they use every day. We don't want to just do problem discovery. We want to be able to fix the problem. So we don't want to give the developer, a huge pile of things to fix. They're generally not very happy about that. And unless you give them a course of action they can take to actually remedy the problem, you're only going to create further problems, and it's not going to fix anything. And then we also want to be able to monitor the whole life cycle. So not only while the developer is working on the application, but you may ship an application today, and it may be perfectly fine, and it may be running in production for a month. At some further point in time, someone may disclose a vulnerability, and because we try to keep track of what's in your application and keep an inventory of what's there, we can notify organizations that they have applications that were once safe that are now in production and have a problem, and you're going to need to fix the problem. So we generally try to approach it from an integrate into the tools, fix the problems, not just discover them, and monitor the whole life cycle and the composition of an application.
Okay, terrific. Okay, so how can organizations factor in compliance and regulatory requirements?
Well, it's along those same lines. From my perspective, security is all about the 3 Ps, right? People, process, and product. Where I find that security sort of breaks down in that is not putting the practice part of security, right? Whether it's regulatory compliance, whether it's security compliance, but the practice part of security in the appropriate hands of the practitioner. So a lot of that is actually focusing that, hey, I can create a great security policy, but if I can't enable it and allow it to be transparent, as Jason mentioned, to the actual hands of the developer, then there's all these avenues for bypass.
Right, good point. So this sounds great. So can you give an example of how maybe one of your customers is using the technology?
Sure. We've been working with a very large financial services firm. They came to us. They had some of the problems we described. They have security concerns, general compliance concerns. They have these manual policies that are on paper, Word documents that people have created, and they're really not, they didn't have any effective way to get these to the developers to actually consume it, understand what it was, let alone try and implement any of the policies that were actually written down. So they were looking for a way to embody these policies in the life cycle that the developers have so that it was visible. So we've started that process with the customer, and that's working now. So the security people in the organization can create policy. The policies are enforced in the tools that the developers use, and they were also trying to keep track of everything that they put in production. So this organization has thousands of applications, and managing thousands of applications which use hundreds of components themselves becomes an intractable problem unless you have some tools to deal with this, effectively monitoring the applications that go out in production.
Well, I hope you both feel very good about how this conversation has gone today. I think we've made great progress. And before we wrap up our conversation, one last thing you'd like to add?
I think some of the solutions are starting to emerge, and they really are, as we've discussed. It needs to be a collaboration between development and the other parts of the organization that care about compliance features, whether that be legal or security. And this is where the problem will be solved, by actually providing developers with the with the information and the tools to actually fix the problem. And I believe that's the only way to actually mitigate the huge amount of risk in applications these days.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, Jason spent the better part of his career learning how to make developers more productive. I spent the better part of my career thinking about how I can make security more accessible to developers. And as Jason mentioned, I think it's important that we continue the dialogue. If you're looking for more information, please just reach out to us. We're both at Sonatype. Just give us a call, give us a holler. We'd love to continue the dialogue. I think it's important that we continue to drive forward the message that security and development can work together, but it only works if we're communicating.
Okay, great, thank you. And if you would like a free risk assessment from Sonatype, just go to www.sonatype.com/CSO. Thank you.